So you have to put it into a simpler form, a more narrative form, cut out a lot of the jargon, put it time-wise. I like to put things time-wise and then build up to the conclusion, but in a more narrative, active style that just doesn't bore you to death.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this episode, we speak with Judy Mathias, clinical editor at OR Manager and Access Intelligence Company. And Melanie, this is going to be a topic about writing, something that you do every single day, not only for First Case, but also with your blog, The Circulating Life. And you're even going to share a little bit of your own story about how you got started with writing on this episode as well.
A little bit, yeah. I love writing. Unfortunately for my children, I do enjoy writing, and I might be a little bit of a grammar police when it comes to their papers that they write, but I enjoy it. But in this conversation, finding out how to go take a love of writing and turn it into adding to our profession, to professional writing, to contributing to magazines and things. How do you get started? How do you get there? It's just a good conversation to have if this is something that anybody is interested in doing. And Judy's got a lot of advice and a lot of years of experience, so she's going to share a lot with us.
All right. We're going to be right back after a short break with Judy Mathias.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
We are speaking with Judy Mathias, clinical editor at OR Manager and Access Intelligence Company, and we're going to be talking about writing today, which I'm very excited about. I know there's many of you out there that have probably thought about writing. I'm sure many of you are reading articles to stay current on best practices and shared experiences. I know that if you're listening to this, you're at least seeing the writing that Melanie is doing in the social media aspects, but Judy is going to be talking to us about writing. And obviously you have a great deal of experience with writing as the clinical editor at OR Manager. So thanks so much for coming on the show.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Judy, why don't you talk a little bit about your background? Like, what kinds of experiences did you have in your professional career leading up to becoming the clinical editor at OR Manager as you are today?
Well, I went to a diploma school of nursing where I actually had 6 months in the operating room, which nobody has anymore. And I sort of hit the ground running. I loved the operating room, got into cardiac surgery, did that for 15 years, went back to school to get my BS degree. And part of getting that, I had to fulfill all of these liberal arts credits that I never got to do in nursing school. And so I started taking literature and writing courses that I thought I would enjoy, and I enjoyed them very much. But I really didn't do anything with them until I was in a skiing accident and I broke my back. And getting back into the operating room was painful. Standing all those hours in cardiac surgery was painful. And I decided I was going to go back to school and get a master's and go somewhere else, but I wasn't really sure where, management or wherever. But the first courses they put me into in school were communication courses, and I loved them. And I decided right then I was going to do something in the communication field. And just as I was finishing my master's, the clinical editor position at the AORN Journal came open, and I applied for it and got it. And that's how I got started into this.
That is so exciting. It's obviously, I think nobody would ever be thankful that they broke their back or be happy.
It's amazing. It's amazing that things we think are destroying our lives can turn us into a direction that opens up a whole new life for us. And that's what happened.
Would you have ever considered writing if that accident had not slowed you down and made it where you could not work on your feet in the OR?
Probably not.
Yeah, it's interesting the path that got you to the writing that you found out that you really liked. I think that's interesting.
So Judy, we recently did an interview with a gentleman who was in medical sales, and at a very young age, he had a hip injury due to a disease that he was born with, and it really slowed him down. And what's interesting is he described something very similar to what you just described. Was like all of a sudden he was used to moving around all the time, and then you're stationary, right? You can't do anything. And very similarly, he told us a story about how he remained productive. And he said, it was just, I could only watch so many movies and take so many visitors who came in and were telling me they felt sorry that I was laid up in bed. And he invested his time in doing, researching all kinds of areas of interest, and that really made him feel very productive. And he dove deep into topics. And I kind of wondered, is that partly what happened there too? Was just, you're so used to being productive, and then all of a sudden that's like ripped away from you. And this was something that you could do to give you that sense of like productivity?
Basically, I laid flat on my back staring at the ceiling for about 6 months. And instead of watching TV, I positioned myself so that I could read. And I read every book I could get my hands on. And so doing a lot of reading, then I started getting ideas about writing. But I still didn't really get serious about it until I decided I couldn't work in the OR anymore. It was too hard on my back. And then getting into the courses and then putting me in the communication courses first, it all fell together. It was like a perfect puzzle came together.
That's wild. When you did decide to start writing and you wanted to write, obviously you're still writing for OR nurses and you're writing in the perioperative space. Did you, from the beginning, want to write for nursing and for nurses, or were you interested in anything else?
I was interested in children's books, actually. And I took quite a few courses on writing for children. But I actually didn't start writing when I worked for AORN. I was mostly editing. I would solicit articles from nurses, which is very difficult to do, getting them to try and write something. Then they would send it to me. Then I would edit it and I would send it back. And then they would rewrite it and send it to me again. And after about the fourth time of this, we had this letter that we would send. It was a made-up letter, which was patterned after the Dan Aykroyd, Jane Curtin on the old Saturday Night Live, and you may not remember it. You're probably not old enough.
I do.
But we would never actually send this letter, but we had so much fun writing them, and it took so much stress off of us that then we were able to be nice and do some more editing. But it's difficult to bring nurses into writing who have never done any writing, but they have a good subject they want to write about, that it's worth it then to get them to make out their outline, make an abstract, make an outline, fill it in, and get started that way. And then you can help them with their active versus passive voice, their grammar, their punctuation, and that sort of thing. And actually, some of them really were brought around to being pretty good writers in the end. Now, all I do is write. I don't edit anymore. For OR Manager, I just write. And I've been doing that since 1990.
Okay, so I want you to go back though to your editing days, and you're receiving articles from nurses, or you're looking for articles from nurses, and think about that and what you were looking for. And if a nurse today was wanting to write or wanting to get into it or had a great idea, what's the first thing they should do? How should they get started in that writing process?
Probably what I did is I read every style book I could get my hands on, like the Chicago Manual of Style, the American Medical Association Manual of Style. And then I read books on writing. There's a really good little book called Writing Well or On Writing Well. There's another book called Miss Thistlebottom's Hobgoblins. I can't say it, but it's all the taboos and outmoded rules of writing in the English usage that has so many good tips in it. But I'll tell you what, one of my favorite books that I still use is my senior high school English book. It had some of the best stuff in it that I haven't found in any other book. And I happened to have a really good English teacher my senior year who also had us doing a lot of writing. And maybe that's where it all started. I don't know. But I would say just start reading every style book, every book on writing you can put your hands on, and get all of those rules down. And then it makes it really easy. For me, it did anyway.
Right. So if they want to write, they're going to read, they're going to learn all these the styles and pay attention to the taboos and grammar and all the things they should and shouldn't be doing. But there's also a style that goes with writing when you're writing to nurses, because nurses, how do you get your point across to nurses? What is the way that you would write so that a nurse would even be interested or understand what you're writing?
First of all, you have to have a good topic. You have to have a topic they're interested in. And then you have to, what I have found is the more medical jargon and passive voice that you see in so many medical journals that just, turns people off so they won't read them. In fact, I have an epidemiologist who, after she writes her studies, sends them to me so I will rewrite them for OR Manager, because she wants the nurses to read them. And they won't read them in the medical journals or the scientific journals. So you have to put it into a simpler form, a more narrative form, cut out a lot of the jargon, put it time-wise. I like to put things time-wise, and then build up to the conclusion, but in a more narrative, active style that just doesn't bore you to death.
Do you think more narrative just because people associate or can relate more to something when they feel like they're reading something that's more story-like versus just facts and figures?
Well, and it's not necessarily, it depends on the subject. But you're still getting the topic, the points across that you want the others to read that will benefit their practice.
So, Judy, you mentioned active versus passive, and I'm kind of wondering, can you give us some examples of those so that everybody can really understand what you mean there? And not only might they notice it more when they read, but we want to motivate people to write, and we want people to be encouraged by your stories. So let's give them some tips.
Well, let's see. One would be, the passive voice would be, 2 sets of instruments will be set up by the scrub nurse on the back table before the case. Very long drawn out. The active way of writing this would be the scrub nurse will set up 2 sets of instruments on the back table. You're about 6 words shorter. But you have to, in the active voice, the subject does the acting. In the passive voice, the subject is acted on. And that's what draws it out and makes it boring. Anyway, for me, that does. And they stay more, I think people stay more in focus when you're more succinct in how you put a sentence together, a shorter sentence. Another one might be, the patient's questions are always answered by the nurse. The active part of that would be, the nurse always answers the patient's questions. I mean, simpler. And after a while, when you start turning these from passive into active, it almost becomes instinctive. And I don't know if they appreciate it or not, but even now when I'm proofing our publication each month, I change sentences from passive to active, and whether they actually get changed, I don't know, but I try to, because I just still have that instinct that I see a passive rather than active, and I want to change it because I think it reads better, it sounds better, and it's the way to write. It's, you need to have an active style of writing.
That's interesting. I'm going to have to make a note to myself. Yes. So that when I write, I make sure I stay out of the passive voice, because I have a tendency, I think, to write that way just because I don't know, maybe it comes back from like being taught to write in this, more formal, more, I don't know what feeds it, but I think there is a tendency, especially with me, to kind of stay passive. So I need to make sure I work on staying active.
Well, I was going to say, I think one of the reasons that I thought of for myself was all of my teachers in nursing school and in college, they speak in a passive voice redundantly to teach you. And so then when you write the way you've been taught through their speaking. I think. I mean, I found that.
Yeah,
so then you have to turn that around. And those same teachers, those faculty, when they write just like they speak, which is very redundant and passive and boring.
Okay. So the 3 takeaways are: don't be redundant, don't be passive, and don't be boring. And if you can do those 3 things.
That's why I podcast, Melanie.
Yeah.
Well, you can always edit out the redundancy, right?
Then you'll be up for a Pulitzer.
Exactly. So let's make this like super specific. If someone wanted to contribute to OR Magazine, if they wanted to get involved with writing and submitting articles to OR Magazine, what are the steps? We've talked about getting a topic and getting an idea, but do they contact OR manager? How do they reach out and get those? Oh yeah, I said OR Magazine, didn't I? I meant to say OR manager. Do they contact OR manager and submit their topic, or do they reach out to you? How do they get involved with writing?
Right now they get in touch with the editor, and typically what they will do is send in an abstract of their idea. Some will send an abstract and an outline, but an abstract of your idea. And then a lot of times the editor, who's not a nurse, will send it to me so that I can give suggestions on what points to cover, what points are needed, and how to expand that abstract, expand that idea, expand that outline. So it has, because sometimes we get these abstracts that they're nursing, but they're not necessarily operating room nursing. And we need to get, they're looking at it from a different, it's operating room nursing, but it's from a more general aspect. And so then I try to nail down to more specific things that they need to cover.
Talk to me about more just about abstracts in general. What, like, that kind of throws me when I'm asked to submit an abstract. Is an abstract a summary of what I'm going to be writing about? Is that really what an abstract is?
Yes.
Or is there more to it?
Yes. No, that's all you need. Just a summary of what you're going to write. And then they can give you, hopefully, ideas on where to expand and elaborate, which points to expand and elaborate on. I know that's what we do. They can send the article in, and then I can give more ideas of where they should expand or make it more operating room nursing than physician oriented or something like that, which sometimes that happens. You get more med surg oriented, and it needs to come back to the operating room because that's our audience, and operating room management in particular. So, but then we give them those, tell them what we would like them to add, and we send it back to them, and then they send us another one. And sometimes I can go back and forth 3 or 4 times, and I won't send them a letter. I won't send them mine.
No letters, just editing.
So, Judy, I can tell you the reason I got into podcasting was because I had just a love of sports and specifically the Boston Celtics. And I was working this job where I had a lot of downtime at a desk doing utilization review nursing. And I got kind of involved in some message boards, and there was a lot of conversation going, and I love to interact. I love dialogue, but I decided to start a blog. And so I started blogging, and what led me to podcasting was I really started struggling with conveying my ideas in writing. I would find that I would publish my blog post and then go back and edit it like 16 times, even after I thought it was perfect the first time. And then I would see all these grammatical errors. And then I remember even in nursing school, I got like a really bad grade on a paper that I wrote that was 25 pages and really met everything that we were supposed to do. And I was like, I did the work. I shouldn't get a D-. And I kind of figured I deserved at least a C for actually hitting all the bullet points and whatnot. So I just remember being discouraged as a writer. And ironically, both my parents were English majors, and I struggled in English classes in high school, and they would red ink my stuff to death before I would like finally turn it in. And I just always, honestly, I guess the best way to describe it is I just felt like a failure with writing. And I felt very discouraged. Now, ironically, when I got to college, I did turn out to be a better writer than I thought. Even when I did the blog, I got a lot of compliments on the writing, but I always thought it was more about the voice. And ultimately, I struggled so much that I just moved over to, running my mouth on a podcast. And so, I got to think a lot of people kind of, might feel discouraged or feel like they're just not meant to write, but I know they have so much to say. And, if they're not somebody who wants to talk kind of like in a public forum, writing is the best way to express themselves. Have you, what would you say to people that are out there that, might be kind of having one of these self-limiting, attitudes about writing for themselves?
Actually, I think blogging is a very good thing to do. I wrote for a couple of blogs, and I think it really helped me to write in a way that came down to the common man instead of the upper echelons of medicine. And I think that's actually a great way to start. And the fact that you're editing yourself over and over is also good, because that means you know the rules. In fact, the more I go over something, the shorter it gets and the better it gets. And I think that's a very good exercise. And English was my favorite class in school. So, and I had several great English teachers. And maybe that's always been there in the back of my head of what I wanted to do. But blogging, I think, is an excellent way to start writing. And then you can almost turn topics from your blog into a topic for an abstract and later an article.
Oh, that's a great tip. So start kind of small.
Yeah,
Get
like a
out
blog
like this
piece.
core thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, I love ideas that are sort of like start with something that's totally doable. And then if as you kind of can build on that, all of a sudden something that you thought was out of reach really comes into picture for you.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe if you're not ready to send something to an editor to have them look at it, get comfortable writing on a blog platform or on LinkedIn or sharing your thoughts somewhere where you write them down, but there's maybe a little less pressure. And then once you get comfortable with writing, then, like you said, turn that into something bigger and send it off and let an editor look at it and see what you can make out of it. I think that's really good. So I want to know, because we're getting close to the end of this interview already, I want to know what you like most about being a perioperative writer.
I love getting up in the morning, coming to my desk, and the first thing I do is go over anything new in research, studies, rules, regulations that have anything to do with the OR environment that has happened in the last 2-3 days. From that, I write my daily newsletter, ORAM, which I just love. And I love doing this. I love writing this. It helps keep me up with the medical nursing literature, the new rules, the new regulations that as an operating room nurse, I never read this stuff. I never knew anything. I mean, I knew that, the basics of aseptic technique and avoiding surgical site infections and that sort of thing. But actually reading the literature and studying it and writing about it now, I am so much more on top of everything and knowing why I did things that I always did. Now I have a better grasp on everything we do in the operating room. I just feel like my writing has put me in touch with research, which has just really broadened my whole mind on everything that has anything to do with the operating room. And I just love that. I love doing the research and then putting it together into either a short piece or a long piece, or getting ideas for a longer piece from a short piece I wrote for the daily newsletter. Another thing, and this is a little bit to the side, but another thing I found I've always loved to do, and I've done several of them now. I mean, it's not good, but it's covering disasters like nursing and the nursing aspect of disasters, like the Denver theater shooting a few years back. I interviewed nurses at the hospital where, a lot of the patients were taken. And I found out, and also with the Boston Marathon bombing, I interviewed nurses there, and you find out if you just let them vent, you can find out things that weren't covered in any other journals or newspapers or anything like that. Like in Denver, I found out that there was a sterile supply tech in the theater that night, crawled on the floor, escaped, got outside, and instead of going home, he went to the hospital because he knew they were going to be doing a lot of surgeries and he knew they would need him to get the instruments ready. I mean, that wasn't anywhere else. And that, it's stuff like that. And like talking to the nurses in Boston and their feelings about a friend of theirs, an ICU nurse who lost a leg during the bombing. But the thing that bothered them the most was that they couldn't leave the hospital. And when they looked outside, they saw all of these military tanks everywhere, and it just scared them to death. It was like being in a different world. They didn't know where in the world all those tanks came from. they couldn't leave the hospital, but stuff like that was not in any other story about these disasters. I like to just let them vent until I find something else, something new. And then I feel really good about that. I mean, it gives me a high. It still gives me a high to write a good article and get it done and feel good about it. I mean, it just gives me a high.
You're obviously very passionate about writing and passionate about writing in the perioperative space, which is what we need. We need good writers. We need people putting all of that knowledge down on paper so that the rest of us can consume it. And actually what you said earlier is very true. You were talking about how you didn't read as much when you were actually in the OR as you do now.
No,
I didn't either. I mean, I didn't have time. I was always working. And so when I was home, I was
running
exhausted.
Around. Yeah.
And then now on the other side of it, doing the education and the podcasting and all this to stay relevant, I have to read. I have to know. I've got a stack of journals and whatever else sitting over here. But you mentioned something and I want to know more. You said that in the morning you get up and you check different websites or information to know what's going on. What are you checking? What are you looking at?
Amazingly, I pretty much know all of the URLs for medical and surgical journals, and I type them in. I look at anything new that's come out. I go to American College of Surgeons. I go to anesthesiologist sites. I go to their journals. I go to nursing publications and just look to see anything new that has come out.
That's cool.
Just like overnight or in the last couple of days, and then just some general websites I have that I go to. And it's always exciting for me to find something brand new that I haven't seen anywhere else. So it's just come out and I get to cover it before anyone else does.
Yeah, no, I think I enjoy
and that
the
makes
same.
Me excited.
Yeah, that is very exciting for me too, to find it. And I'm like, this
is
amazing. I have to tell people.
I love to scoop the other daily newsletter people.
So we are out of time. It's amazing how much time flies when you talk about something you love. And when you're talking about something as interesting and exciting as being able to write and then the ways we can contribute to our profession. But before we go, do you have anything else you would like to add? Any final thoughts before we finish this interview?
I would say we need more nurse writers, definitely. If you're interested, take a couple of courses in writing, read the style books, start reading the journals. Nurses who can write are few and far between. And if you like it, pursue it. There are a lot of job openings out there and no one to fill them. So if you have that interest at all, it'll open up a whole new field for you, a whole new avenue to get and I'm passionate about operating room nursing, as passionate about operating room nurses as I am about writing. And you can pass on that passion when you're a writer, that you really, you're passionate while you're in the operating room, but nobody knows it until you can express that in talking or a blog or writing.
Yeah. And you also have a passion for people. The way you just described, listening to people who have been through, some pretty traumatic experiences, you're providing a value there to them too. It's not just about the writing process or discovering something that's interesting, although I think that probably gives some real value even back to them when you do discover that. But I got to think that you're also really allowing them a vehicle for catharsis, right?
Oh, definitely. Most definitely.
Really, yeah. And so you don't do that unless you really like people too, Judy. So I thought that of everything we talked about today, that was really interesting to me, and even your whole approach to it. So I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I think this is definitely a unique episode throughout our professional development season, and I'm glad you came on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
That was Judy Mathias, clinical editor at OR Manager, an access intelligence company. And Melanie, I know this one was near and dear to your heart. I kind of turned my back on writing 20 years ago and started podcasting as an alternative. But I really like how she kind of handled that question, but even more so intriguing the way that she has kind of investigated or interviewed people that have been, part of, really just like these traumatic experiences and her whole approach there. And then what she discovers about human nature, which I think is so interesting.
Yeah, that was like an undiscovered gem in this interview. Wasn't expecting to find that out, that she had done that. But people who have been through traumatic experiences, when they're ready and they want to talk about it, they want to be heard and they want their experiences validated. So to have somebody interested in what they have to say and somebody who wants to hear their story, people like to tell their stories. And I think that even feeds into talking about writing, because we can write our stories, we can share our stories, and other people can learn from them. So it's just really a very good interview tonight. I enjoyed it.
That's going to do it for this episode, but Judy did a really great job. And I do want to remind everybody, you can download our smartphone app for iPhone or Android. It's the best way to listen to the show. But if you've already got Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, you can find us there, as well as Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or Spotify. If you've got a different app you use for podcasts, no worries. Just simply search for First Case, and you will find us there. While you're there, we'd love a rating and a review. And I also want to remind everybody that you can send us an email with feedback about the show, recommendations for future topics, themes for a season. Maybe there's a guest who has an interesting story to tell. We would love to hear about it. Send an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. On behalf of Melanie and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of First Case.